There are moments in life that mark a before and an after. Moments that shake you so hard they awaken something within you that you never even knew existed. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 68 years old, and throughout my life, I have been a woman who has given ground for love. I gave in when my husband wanted to paint the house blue instead of green. I gave in when my son Edward wanted to study engineering instead of following the family business. And I kept giving in, even after becoming a widow, when loneliness began to weigh on my shoulders like a wet blanket in winter. My house in Willow Creek, Oregon, has witnessed laughter, tears, celebrations, and farewells. Every corner holds a story. Every crack in the wall tells a secret. Arthur and I built this house with the sweat of our brows. 40 years of working as a teacher at St. Michael's Elementary, 40 years saving every dollar, giving up vacations and luxuries to have our own roof over our heads. Arthur didn't get to enjoy it as much as we would have liked. Cancer took him 5 years ago, leaving me with memories, with yellowed photographs, and with a house too big for just one person. When Edward lost his job at the construction company, I felt it was a sign. My son, my only son, would come home with his wife, Lillian, and my 2 grandchildren, David and Sophie. I thought the house would once again be filled with life, that laughter would return to these walls that had spent too long listening only to the echo of my footsteps. I prepared the rooms with anticipation, bought fresh flowers, baked homemade bread, and cleaned every last corner. I wanted them to feel welcome, to feel that this was their home, too. The day they arrived, I hugged Edward tightly. He was thinner, with deep circles under his eyes and that look of someone defeated. My mother's heart ached. David, my oldest grandson, hugged me as always with that tenderness that reminds me so much of his grandfather. Sophie, on the other hand, barely greeted me, too busy with her phone. And then there was Lillian, with her perfectly styled hair and that smile that never reached her eyes. "Thank you for having us, Eleanor," she said with that voice of hers, sweet but cold as steel. "It will be temporary, of course. As soon as Edward finds another job, we'll go back to our own place." Something in her tone made me feel like a stranger in my own home, but I ignored it. These are difficult times for everyone, I thought. Losing a job can hurt one's pride, especially for a woman like Lillian, accustomed to a certain lifestyle. The first few hours passed in a flurry of suitcases, boxes, and decisions about who would sleep where. Lillian insisted on taking the master bedroom, the one I had shared with Arthur for 30 years. I didn't object. After all, they needed their space as a couple. I could sleep perfectly well in the small room overlooking the garden, where I could hear the birds singing every morning. That first day, I prepared a special dinner. Beef stew, my mother's recipe, the same one I cooked when Edward was little and came home hungry from playing basketball at the community center. I set the table with my fine china, the set I only used on special occasions. I lit candles and even opened a bottle of wine that Arthur and I had saved for an important celebration. The family is together again, I thought as I stirred the pot. That's reason enough to celebrate. At 8 o'clock sharp, I called everyone to the table. David was the first to arrive, helping me serve. Edward appeared looking tired, but gave me a sincere smile when he saw the stew. Sophie sat down without looking up from her phone, and finally, Lillian appeared, with freshly styled hair and a dress that seemed too elegant for a family dinner. I remember every detail of that moment, as if it were happening right now before my eyes. The steam rising from the freshly served plates, the aroma of fresh herbs from the garden, the clinking of silverware against the china. Everything seemed perfect, a family scene like those I had dreamed of during my years of solitude. I was serving the last plate, mine, when Lillian placed her silverware on the table with a sharp clatter that echoed in the silent dining room. She looked at me fixedly with those dark eyes that seemed like bottomless wells, and said the words that changed everything. "I'm in charge of this house now. Take your plate and go eat outside with the dogs." Time seemed to stand still. David dropped his fork, which bounced off the plate with a metallic clink. Edward paled, but said nothing, his eyes fixed on his food, as if the stew had suddenly become the most interesting thing in the world. Sophie let out a nervous giggle, looking at her mother with a mixture of awe and admiration, and I felt as if I had been doused with a bucket of ice water. It wasn't so much the humiliation, although that hurt deeply. It was seeing that my son, my Edward, the boy I had raised with so much love, said nothing. He didn't defend me. He remained silent, accepting that his wife would treat me like a servant in my own home. I could have screamed, I could have cried, I could have demanded respect. But in that moment, something inside me, something that had been dormant for a long time, awakened. A quiet strength, an absolute certainty of what I had to do. I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy or even of resignation. It was the smile of someone who finally sees things clearly after a long time in the fog. I calmly got up, took the cordless phone that always rested on the small table next to the refrigerator, and dialed a number I knew by heart. Everyone was looking at me. Lillian with defiance, Edward with shame, David with sadness, Sophie with teenage curiosity. "Who are you calling, Mom?" Edward finally asked, finding his voice, though weak and trembling. I didn't answer. I waited for them to pick up on the other end. When I heard the familiar voice, I simply said, "Grace, the time has come. Activate Protocol Dawn." I hung up and sat back down at the table. I picked up my spoon and began to eat my stew as if nothing had happened. "What was that?" Lillian asked, her tone no longer as confident as before. "Who did you call?" "A friend," I replied calmly. "You'll understand tomorrow. Now let's eat. The food is getting cold." The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. I could feel the confused glances, the tension growing in the air, but I felt strangely at peace, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. That night, while everyone slept, I went out to the garden and sat with my dogs, those faithful companions who had never judged me, who gave me their unconditional love without asking for anything in return. I stroked their heads and whispered, "Things are going to change, my friends. Eleanor Hayes has remembered who she is." And that's how it all began. With a humiliation, a phone call, and a decision that would change not only my life, but that of my entire family. Because what Lillian didn't know, what no one knew, was that I was already prepared for that moment. 5 years of widowhood had taught me many things, including that I had to protect myself even from those I loved most. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else, as had been my custom since I was young. There's something special about those first hours of the day, when the world still seems asleep and you can hear your own thoughts clearly. I made coffee as always, the aroma filling the kitchen, that space that had always been my kingdom, my sanctuary. I sat in my old rocking chair by the window overlooking the backyard, watching as the first rays of the sun illuminated the flowers Arthur and I had planted together so many years ago. This house, our house, how much history do these walls hold? I remember the day we bought it, just a plot of land with foundations and many promises. Arthur, with his unbreakable optimism, took my hands and told me, "We'll build our life here, Eleanor." And boy, did we. Every brick laid represented a sacrifice. Every wall raised was a dream fulfilled. I worked 40 years as a teacher at the neighborhood school. 40 years waking up before dawn, preparing lessons, grading papers until late at night, organizing school festivals, drying the tears of children who are now parents and even grandparents. 40 years saving every dollar, giving up vacations, new clothes, small luxuries, all to build this home. Arthur worked at the car factory, often pulling double shifts, coming home with calloused hands and an aching back, but always with a smile for me and Edward. We never lacked the essentials, but we never had excess either. When we finally finished paying the last mortgage installment, Arthur's hair was already white, and I had started wearing reading glasses. Edward grew up in this house. He took his first steps on this very wooden floor that now creaks under my feet. He learned to ride his bike on the street outside. He broke his arm falling from the tree in the backyard. He celebrated his graduation with a small party in the garden. His room still holds posters of his favorite teams, sports trophies, and books from his adolescence that he never took with him when he married Lillian. Lillian appeared in our lives 20 years ago when Edward was in college. She was beautiful, intelligent, ambitious. Arthur welcomed her with open arms, typical of his trusting nature. I, however, felt something strange from the beginning. A distance, a coldness behind her perfect smile. I never mentioned it. I didn't want to be the typical meddling mother-in-law. Maybe I should have been. They married young, too young in my opinion, but Edward was in love. They bought a small apartment downtown with financial help from Arthur and me. Soon David, our first grandson, arrived, and 3 years later, Sophie. Lillian quit her job to dedicate herself to the children, something that always seemed strange to me, considering her independent personality. Edward was promoted at the construction company. Their income improved. They moved to a larger house in an upscale neighborhood. Visits to our house became scarcer. When Arthur fell ill, Edward usually came alone. Lillian is busy with the kids, he would explain, even though the children weren't so little anymore. During the 2 years of his illness, Lillian visited Arthur in the hospital exactly 3 times. At the funeral, she cried tears that didn't reach her eyes, receiving condolences as if she were the primary mourner. I saw her observing the house with calculating eyes while the neighbors hugged me. After Arthur's death, loneliness hit me harder than ever before. It's one thing to be alone. It's quite another to feel alone. For months, the house felt too big, too silent. The spaces we once shared were now constant reminders of his absence. His empty armchair, his side of the bed cold, his coffee cup untouched in the cupboard. Edward would visit me on Sundays, sometimes with the children, almost never with Lillian. I noticed his concern, his glances evaluating if I could manage on my own. "Mom, have you thought about selling the house? It's too big for you," he suggested on several occasions. "You could buy something smaller, easier to maintain, maybe closer to us." I always refused. This house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the vessel of my memories, the last tangible link to Arthur. It was during those first few months of grief that I met Doris Miller at the Widows Support Group at St. Michael's Parish. Doris had lost her husband 2 years earlier and owned a small shop in the neighborhood. She invited me for coffee at her house, and there I met Grace Vance, her niece, a lawyer. That day changed my life. Doris told me her story, so similar, yet so different from mine. Her eldest son had convinced her to put the house in his name for security, and 6 months later he had admitted her to a nursing home against her will to sell the property. Grace had legally rescued her, but the house was already lost. "Older people are vulnerable, Eleanor," Doris told me as she poured more coffee. "Especially women, especially widows. The world sees us as burdens, as incapable children, or as spoils to be divided." That night, I couldn't sleep. Doris's words resonated in my mind. Would Edward be capable of something like that? I wanted to believe no, but his insistent suggestions to sell the house took on a new meaning. And if not Edward, what about Lillian? I had seen her look at the house with those calculating eyes too many times. The following week, I visited Grace's law firm downtown. I told her my worries, my fears. She didn't judge me. She didn't tell me I was being paranoid. Instead, she told me about similar cases she had handled, of children who had dispossessed their elderly parents, of daughters-in-law and sons-in-law who had taken control of properties. "Ms. Hayes," she said with a firm but kind voice, "love is wonderful, but legal paperwork protects. Trust is not a document that holds up in court." That's how the New Dawn Foundation was born, with my house as its first asset, and Arthur's life insurance policy as initial capital. Legally, the house was no longer mine. It belonged to the foundation, with the condition that I could live there the rest of my life as its director. Any decision about the property had to go through the board of directors, Grace, Doris, Father Michael, and me. Robert Davies, my lifelong neighbor, a widower like me, found out about our project during one of our evening chats in the garden. He not only supported the idea, but became one of our main donors. "This is what Arthur would have wanted," he told me one day, "for you to be protected, for your kindness to help others. In the following years, the foundation grew quietly. We helped 3 other widows protect their properties. We offered legal advice to dozens of seniors. We created a small emergency fund, all discreetly, without publicity, without my family knowing, not because I completely distrusted Edward, but as a preventative measure. It's like an umbrella, I told myself. You hope you don't need it, but you carry it in case it rains. And then the storm came. Edward lost his job at the construction company. The economy was bad. There were massive layoffs. At 42 years old, with a mortgage, 2 teenage children, and an expensive lifestyle to maintain, my son suddenly found himself out of work. Sunday calls became more frequent. Questions about the house became more direct. "Mom, we've been thinking. The house is too big for you alone. We could move in with you temporarily until I find another job. It would be good for you to have company, and for us to save a little." I couldn't refuse. He's my son, my only son. And despite my reservations, the idea of having the house full again, of hearing my grandchildren's voices, filled me with hope. Maybe everything would work out. Maybe my precautions had been exaggerated. Protocol Dawn was Grace's idea, a rapid action plan in case the situation became untenable. A simple call would activate a series of legal measures designed to protect me and the foundation. I never thought I would have to use it, much less on the first day of cohabitation. That night, after the disastrous dinner and the phone call, I slept surprisingly well. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I was in control of my life, of my destiny. Lillian's cruel words, instead of sinking me, had liberated me. I no longer had to pretend, no longer had to endure to maintain a fictitious peace. The next morning, as I drank my early coffee, I received a message from Grace. "All set, we'll be there at 10. I took my time getting ready. I chose my blue dress, Arthur's favorite. I styled my hair carefully. I even put on a little makeup. If I was going to face a battle, I would do so with dignity. At 9:30, Lillian came down to the kitchen, already dressed and ready, as if she were going to an important meeting. She looked at me with some surprise, perhaps expecting to find me devastated by last night's events. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said with that falsely sweet tone of hers. "What's for breakfast?" "Good morning, Lillian," I replied calmly. "There's fresh coffee, bread in the breadbasket, and fruit in the refrigerator. Help yourself to whatever you like." She frowned slightly, as if my lack of subservience annoyed her. She poured herself coffee in silence and sat across from me. "About last night," she began, not looking directly at me. "I was tired from the move, stressed by the situation. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." It wasn't a real apology. It was a justification. There was no repentance in her voice, only the convenience of maintaining appearances. Years ago, I would have accepted those empty words to keep the peace. But not anymore. "Lillian," I said calmly, "we both know you said exactly what you wanted to say. What you don't know is that you made a grave mistake." She looked at me in surprise. She didn't expect that answer. Before she could reply, the doorbell rang. "That must be for me," I said, getting up. "I'm expecting visitors." At the door were Grace with her lawyer's briefcase, Robert with his distinguished air of a former police officer, and the public notary Grace had brought to attest to what was about to happen. I invited them in just as Edward came down the stairs, still in his pajamas, looking like he hadn't slept well. "Mom, what's going on? Who are these people?" "They're friends of mine, Edward, and they're here for legal matters that concern all of us. Why don't you wake the children? This affects them too." The next few minutes were confusing. David and Sophie came downstairs, still groggy. Lillian demanded explanations. Edward seemed lost. We all gathered in the living room, that room where we had celebrated so many Christmases, where Arthur and I watched television hand in hand every night. Grace took the floor, professional and direct. She explained the existence of the New Dawn Foundation, my role as director, the legal status of the house. She showed the documents, the property titles, the bylaws signed and sealed years ago. The notary attested to their authenticity. "In summary," Grace concluded, "this property legally belongs to the New Dawn Foundation. with the condition that Ms. Eleanor Hayes resides here as lifelong director. Anyone living in this house must sign a lease agreement with the foundation and pay monthly rent, or, alternatively, they can vacate within 30 days. The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. Edward looked at me as if he didn't recognize me, as if I were suddenly a stranger. Lillian went from astonishment to fury in a matter of seconds. "This is a scam," she yelled. "Edward, do something! It's your mother, for God's sake! She's crazy!" "We need to have her committed." "Ms. Walsh," Robert intervened with his calm but authoritative voice, "I suggest you choose your words carefully. Everything Dr. Vance has explained is perfectly legal. The papers have been in order for 5 years, long before you even thought about moving in here." David, my oldest grandson, was sitting on the sofa with an indecipherable expression, his eyes darting from his mother to me and then to the documents on the table. Sophie, for the first time since they arrived, wasn't looking at her phone. She looked like a little girl again, lost and confused. "I don't understand," Edward finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, why did you do this? Why didn't you trust me?" His question hurt me more than Lillian's hurtful words. In his eyes, I saw betrayal, as if I had been the one who broke an invisible pact between us. "Son," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, "this isn't about trust. It's about protection, not just mine, but that of other seniors who have been abandoned or mistreated. When your father died, I realized how vulnerable a single woman can be at my age. I decided to do something about it, to turn my situation into an opportunity to help others. But you could have told me," Edward insisted. "I'm your son. I would never have hurt you." Before I could respond, Lillian let out a bitter laugh. "Seriously, you're so naive, Edward. It's clear she did all this because she doesn't trust us, because she's a manipulative old woman who prefers to give her house to strangers rather than her own family." "Lillian, enough!" Edward interrupted her, but without much conviction. "Enough!" Her voice rose with each word. "We moved here thinking we could save money, that we'd get a financial break while you looked for work, and now it turns out we have to pay rent or leave. Do you realize what your mother has done? She has deceived us." "No one has deceived you," Grace intervened calmly. "You assumed the house belonged to Ms. Hayes personally, but you never asked. And allow me to remind you, Ms. Walsh, that it was you who yesterday told Ms. Hayes to go eat with the dogs. That doesn't seem to me to be the attitude of someone who values and respects the person providing them with a roof over their head." Lillian flushed, half embarrassment, half fury. She looked at Edward, seeking support, but my son seemed to be sinking into an abyss of confusion and pain. "You have 2 options," Grace continued, professional until the end. "You can sign a lease agreement and remain in the house, paying a monthly rent commensurate with the market, or you can vacate within 30 days. The decision is yours." "How much would the rent be?" Edward asked, defeated. Grace named a figure that, although fair for a house of that size in that neighborhood, I knew was out of Edward's reach in his current situation. I watched his shoulders slump even further. "This is absurd," he murmured. "We can't afford that. We barely have enough savings for a couple of months." "There's a third option," I said then, feeling that I should offer my son a hand. "Despite everything, you can stay temporarily without paying rent, but with some conditions." Grace looked at me in surprise. We hadn't discussed this possibility. "What conditions?" Edward asked, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Respect," I replied simply. "Respect for me, for my house, for my decisions. I am not a servant, nor a burden, nor an obstacle. I am the director of the New Dawn Foundation and the legal owner of this house. If you can accept that, we can negotiate a temporary cost-free stay while Edward finds work." Lillian opened her mouth to protest, but Edward stopped her with a gesture. "I need time to process all this," my son said. "We can talk later, Mom. Just you and me." I nodded. Grace left the documents on the table, including a draft of the lease agreement and a copy of the Foundation's bylaws. The notary certified the delivery, and everyone left. not without exchanging a few words with me in private beforehand. "Are you sure about this, Eleanor?" Grace asked me with concern. "After what happened last night, it doesn't seem prudent." "I have to give my son a chance," I replied. "It's not him who disrespected me." "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," Robert murmured, who had always been protective of me, "and that tree has rotten roots." I thanked them for their concern, but assured them I would be fine. We agreed to maintain daily communication, and at any sign of problems, we would activate the rest of Protocol Dawn, a preventative restraining order, and my temporary relocation to Doris's place. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Lillian locked herself in the master bedroom, refusing to come out even to eat. Sophie followed her, shooting me resentful glances, as if I had ruined some perfect plan. David, on the other hand, approached me while I was watering the plants in the garden. "Grandma," he said softly, "I'm so sorry about last night. What Mom said wasn't right." I looked at him tenderly. David had always been a sensitive child, too mature for his age. He reminded me so much of Edward when he was young, before ambition and Lillian's influence transformed him. "It's not your fault, my love," I assured him. "Adults sometimes complicate our lives unnecessarily." "The foundation thing is incredible," he continued, sitting beside me on the wooden bench Arthur had built. "Do you really help other grandmas?" I told him about our work, about Margaret, a widow who had been kicked out of her house by her son-in-law, about Albert, a widower who had been swindled by his own nephew, about Carmen, who slept on the street because her children had sold her house while she was hospitalized. David listened, fascinated, asking intelligent questions, suggesting ideas. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened with Edward and Lillian, my grandson would be fine. He had Arthur's heart, and perhaps a little of my determination. As evening fell, Edward finally came to talk to me. We sat in the kitchen, that space that had always been the heart of our home. I poured him a coffee, just as I used to when he was a teenager, and came to tell me his problems. "Why, Mom?" he asked bluntly. "Why didn't you tell me anything about the foundation?" "At first, it was just a precaution," I explained. "I saw cases in the news of elderly people swindled by their own children or abandoned in nursing homes against their will. Then I met Doris and her story, and other people who had been through similar situations. I realized I could do more than just protect myself." "But I would never have done anything like that to you," he insisted, hurt. I looked him in the eyes, those eyes so much like his father's. "Edward, when your father was alive, you came to see us every week. After his death, visits became spaced out. There was always an excuse. Work, the children, commitments. I don't blame you. Life goes on, and you have your own responsibilities. But it made me realize how alone I was, how vulnerable I was. And yes, I also saw how Lillian looked at this house, how she made comments about selling it, about it being too big for me. It wasn't hard to imagine what would happen if one day I couldn't fend for myself." Edward remained silent, looking into his coffee cup, as if he could find answers to questions he didn't even know he had. "About last night," he began, clearly uncomfortable. "What Lillian said wasn't right. I should have defended you." "Yes, you should have," I agreed, not to punish him, but without sugarcoating the truth. "Your silence hurt more than her words." "Things haven't been easy lately," he confessed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded me so much of Arthur. "Losing my job, the mortgage, the kids' tuition. Lillian is stressed. I'm stressed. We came here because we had no other option, but I guess she saw it as an opportunity to, I don't know, to take control of something amidst the chaos. I understand the stress, son, but that doesn't justify disrespect. This house has been and will always be your home, but not at the expense of my dignity." Edward nodded slowly, as if for the first time assimilating the magnitude of what had happened and what was at stake. "What's going to happen now?" he asked. "That depends on you," I replied. "As I said before, you can stay temporarily without paying rent, but on the condition of mutual respect. Lillian will have to apologize not only to me, but to the entire family for her behavior, and we'll have to establish some basic rules for living together. Lillian isn't very good at apologizing, Edward murmured. Then she'll have to learn, I said firmly, or find somewhere else to live. The conversation continued late into the night. We talked about his job search, the children, the foundation. At times, I felt like I was getting back my Edward, that sensitive and fair boy Arthur and I had raised. But I also saw the man trapped between his loyalty to me and to the woman he had chosen as his life partner. When he finally went to sleep, I stayed alone in the kitchen, with only the company of the old wall clock that Arthur had repaired so many times. I thought of him, of what he would have done in my place. Arthur was always a fair man, but also tremendously loyal to his family. He would have approved of my actions. He would have understood my motives. "Arthur," I whispered into the empty kitchen, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." That night, I couldn't sleep well. I tossed and turned, reviewing the day's events, wondering if I should have been tougher or more flexible. At some point, I heard angry voices from the master bedroom. Edward and Lillian were arguing, their words muffled by the walls, but the intensity of their anger clearly perceptible. The next morning, Lillian didn't come down for breakfast. Edward looked exhausted, with deep circles under his eyes and a defeated expression. The children were unusually silent. The atmosphere in the house was like the calm before a storm, heavy, oppressive, charged with electricity. "Lillian says she prefers to leave," Edward announced as he poured himself coffee. "She says she can't live under these conditions, that it's humiliating." I wasn't surprised. Lillian had always been proud, incapable of admitting her mistakes or apologizing. "And what do you think?" I asked, preparing myself for any answer. Edward sighed deeply. "I don't know what to think, Mom. On one hand, I understand your position. What Lillian did was wrong, and your conditions are reasonable. On the other hand, she's my wife, the mother of my children. We're going through a difficult time, and I don't want to divide the family further." "Sometimes," I said, choosing my words carefully, "keeping a family together at any cost can do more harm than good. Respect must be the foundation of any relationship, Edward. Without that, there is only domination and submission." My son looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, or perhaps as if rediscovering something in me he had forgotten over the years. "You were always strong, weren't you? Even when you seemed to give in to Dad, even when you let us make our own decisions, even if you didn't agree. That wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of strength." I smiled, touched by his belated but sincere understanding. "Life has taught me that there are many ways to be strong, son, and sometimes the greatest strength is in setting clear boundaries." That day, Lillian packed her bags. She decided to go to her sister's house in Miami, Florida, taking Sophie with her. Edward and David would stay with me while he continued looking for work. The farewell was tense, without tears or hugs. Lillian barely looked at me, and Sophie gave me a cold kiss on the cheek at her father's insistence. As the taxi drove away, carrying half the family, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. I didn't want to be the cause of their separation, but I also couldn't continue to allow such treatment. "Did I do the right thing?" I asked Robert that night, who had come for tea to check that everything was all right. "You did what was necessary," he replied, with that quiet wisdom that always comforted me. Sometimes both things coincide, sometimes they don't, but it's always better to live according to your principles than to betray yourself to please others. The following days were a period of adjustment. Edward spent hours sending resumes, attending interviews, making calls. David volunteered at the foundation, fascinated by the idea of helping others. And little by little, I regained my place in my own home, my voice, my dignity. One afternoon, as David and I were sorting donations for the foundation in the living room, Edward walked in with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. "Eleanor," he announced, "I have an interview tomorrow for a supervisor position at a new construction company. The salary isn't as good as before, but it's a start." I hugged him, genuinely happy for him. Perhaps this crisis, as painful as it had been, would be the catalyst for a new beginning for everyone. That night, after dinner, Edward handed me an envelope. "It's from Lillian," he explained. "She asked me to give it to you." With some apprehension, I opened the envelope and read the letter it contained. It was brief, just a few lines, but it took my breath away. "Dear Eleanor," Lillian had written in her elegant handwriting, "circumstances have forced me to reflect on my actions. I recognize that my behavior was unacceptable, and I apologize for the pain I have caused. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am working on being a better person. For Edward, for the children, and for myself. Sincerely, Lillian." It wasn't a particularly emotional or lengthy letter, but coming from Lillian, it was almost revolutionary. I looked at Edward, who was carefully observing my reaction. "She's seeing a therapist," he explained. "It was her sister's idea. It seems this situation has made her confront some things from her past, from her relationship with her own mother." I nodded, not knowing exactly what to say. People are rarely entirely villains. Most act from their own wounds, from their deepest fears. "Do you think one day we can be a family again?" Edward asked, and in his voice I heard the child who once asked me if the sun would rise again after a particularly strong storm. "Time will tell," I replied, putting the letter away. "But to rebuild, you first have to acknowledge what's broken, and it seems that process has already begun." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a full month. Since that first day, when Lillian ordered me to eat with the dogs, spring was advancing in Willow Creek, painting my garden with colors and scents that always reminded me of Arthur. He loved this time of year, when we could sit on the back patio and watch the flowers push their way through the damp earth, promising new life. Edward got the job at the construction company. It wasn't the executive position he had before, but it would allow him to start rebuilding his financial life. David continued helping me with the foundation, showing surprising sensitivity and maturity for his 17 years. We talked with Sophie on video calls almost every day. I noticed her was different. More thoughtful, less engrossed in her phone, and more present in our conversations. One particularly sunny morning, as I was having breakfast with Edward and David, the doorbell rang. It was Grace, my lawyer and friend, with an indecipherable expression on her face. "Ms. Hayes," she said after the greetings, "I need to speak with you about an important matter in private, if possible." I led her to the study that had been Arthur's, that small corner of the house where he kept his poetry books, and I kept my important documents. Edward followed us with his eyes, concern evident on his face. "What's going on, Grace?" I asked, once we closed the door. "You're scaring me." "A delicate situation has arisen," she explained, taking some documents from her briefcase. "I received a call yesterday from a lawyer representing Lillian Walsh." My heart skipped a beat. Despite the apology letter, a part of me had always feared that Lillian would try something legal against the foundation or against me. "What does she want?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "It's not what you think," Grace reassured me. "She's not coming to claim anything. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Lillian wants to make a donation to the New Dawn Foundation." I was speechless. Of all the possibilities I could have imagined, this was the last. "A donation? Lillian?" I stammered, unable to hide my astonishment. Grace nodded. Just as perplexed as I am, according to her lawyer, she has sold some of her jewelry and wants to donate the money specifically for family mediation programs between seniors and their children or daughters-in-law. She says it's her way of making amends. I slowly sat in Arthur's chair, trying to process this information. The Lillian I knew would never have sold her precious jewelry, much less to donate the money to a cause unrelated to her interests. "How much?" I finally asked. $10,000, Grace replied. "It's not a huge amount for the foundation, but considering her current financial situation, it's significant. Her lawyer mentioned that it was jewelry given to her by her father." Her father's jewelry. Now I understood better. Lillian rarely spoke of her family, but Edward had told me that her relationship with her parents had been complicated. Her father, a wealthy businessman, had showered her with material gifts, but withheld affection. Her mother, as far as I knew, had been a distant and critical woman, obsessed with appearances. "Is there anything else?" Grace continued. "Lillian has requested a meeting with you, just the two of you, without lawyers, without family. She says she has something important to tell you in person." The mere idea of being alone with Lillian sent a shiver down my spine. Our last interaction had been so unpleasant that the prospect of reliving it, even under different circumstances, filled me with anxiety. "You don't have to accept," Grace clarified, seeing my expression. "I can politely decline the request or suggest a meeting with mediators present." I took a deep breath, remembering what Arthur always said, "Fear is natural, Eleanor, but don't let it stop you from doing the right thing." "I'll see her," I decided, "but here, in my house, with Edward and David present in the house, though not necessarily in the same room." Grace accepted my terms and promised to organize the meeting for the following week. When we left the study, Edward was waiting in the hallway with a worried expression. "Is everything all right?" he asked, looking alternately at Grace and me. "Everything is fine," I assured him. "But we need to talk. Lillian has requested a meeting with me." The news surprised Edward, who ran a hand through his hair in that gesture of his that always reminded me of his father. "What for? What does she want now?" he asked with a hint of bitterness. Despite the letter and the video calls with the children, their relationship remained tense. I explained about the donation and the meeting request. Edward listened with an incredulous expression. "She sold her father's jewelry? I can't believe it. Lillian adored that jewelry. It was her last link to him." "People can change, son," I said, although I had my own reservations, or at least they can try. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with preparation, both practical and emotional. Robert insisted on being present on the day of the visit, even if he was just in the garden pruning roses. David offered to bake cookies, remembering that Lillian liked chocolate chip with walnuts. Edward fluctuated between hope and skepticism, not knowing what to expect from this new Lillian who seemed to be emerging from the ashes of our conflict. The morning of the meeting dawned cloudy with that diffused light that softens contours and blurs shadows. I dressed with special care, choosing a light blue outfit that Arthur always said highlighted the color of my eyes. It wasn't vanity. It was a way to arm myself with confidence, to remind myself who I was and everything I had overcome in my 68 years of life. Lillian arrived punctually, driving herself instead of taking a taxi as we expected. I watched her from the window as she parked in front of the house. She looked different, less rigid in her movements. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate hairstyle she usually wore. She was dressed simply, almost austerely for her usual standards. Edward opened the door, his face a mask of studied neutrality. They exchanged a few words that I couldn't hear, a brief hug that seemed more procedural than affectionate. And then Edward led her to the living room where I was waiting. When our gazes met, I saw something I had never seen before in Lillian's eyes: vulnerability. She wasn't the haughty, dominant woman who had ordered me to eat with the dogs. She seemed smaller in some way, as if something inside her had deflated. "Good morning, Eleanor," she greeted in a soft, unsure voice. "Thank you for seeing me." "Good morning, Lillian," I replied, motioning for her to take a seat opposite me. "Can I offer you coffee or tea?" "Tea would be nice, thank you." Edward left to prepare it, leaving us alone in an uncomfortable silence that seemed to amplify with each passing second. Finally, Lillian spoke. "I've been seeing a therapist," she began, looking at her intertwined hands in her lap. "At first it was at my sister's insistence, but then I started to see things about myself, about my patterns, things that aren't pleasant to acknowledge." I remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. What she was doing wasn't easy. I could see it in the tension of her shoulders, in how she avoided my direct gaze. "My mother," she continued after a pause, "was very much like me. Or rather, I became someone very much like her, controlling, perfectionistic, unable to show vulnerability. She believed respect was imposed, not earned. I treated others as she treated me." Edward returned with the tea, poured it in silence, and then retreated again, respecting our space but staying close enough to intervene if necessary. "What I did to you," Lillian continued after taking a sip of her tea, "what I said to you that day was unforgivable. But it wasn't just about you. It was about me and my insecurities. When Edward lost his job, I felt like I was losing control of my life. Moving into your house, depending on your help, made me feel small, defenseless. And I reacted by trying to control the only thing I could, the space, the family dynamics. I made you the target of my frustration." Her words surprised me, not so much for their content, but for their honesty. The Lillian I knew would never have admitted weakness or error. "The donation," she continued, now looking directly at me, "it's not an attempt to buy your forgiveness. I know what I did can't be erased with money. It's my way of acknowledging the value of your work, of contributing something positive after so much negativity. The jewelry was important to me, but more important is trying to repair the harm I've caused." "And Sophie?" I asked, thinking of my granddaughter who had witnessed everything. "How is she?" Lillian's expression softened as she spoke of her daughter. "She's good, better than good. In fact, this situation has made her see things too. She was starting to follow in my footsteps, to adopt my attitudes. Seeing the consequences of my behavior was like a mirror for her. We're learning together to be different." I took a moment to process everything she was telling me. One part of me, the wounded and cautious part, wondered if this was genuine or just a strategy to move back into the house without paying rent. But another part, perhaps the part Arthur always encouraged in me, wanted to believe in the possibility of change. "Lillian," I finally said, "I appreciate your honesty and your donation. The foundation can do a lot of good with that money. As for everything else, forgiveness isn't something that's given once and forever. It's a process, both for the one who forgives and for the one who is forgiven." She nodded, accepting my words without protest. "I don't expect us to go back to how we were," she clarified. "Honestly, I don't think we ever had a real relationship, just a series of superficial exchanges marked by my judgment and your silent resentment. But perhaps we can build something new, something based on mutual respect, for Edward, for the children, and for ourselves." At that moment, David entered with a tray of freshly baked cookies, his way of participating in this reconciliation. Lillian looked at him with surprise and emotion. "Did you make these?" she asked, recognizing her favorite cookies. "With Grandma's recipe," David confirmed with a small smile, "though I think I put in too many walnuts." "There are never too many walnuts," Lillian replied, and for a moment, a brief and precious moment, we all smiled. The conversation continued, more relaxed now, with David acting as a bridge between us. We talked about Sophie, about school, about the foundation. Edward eventually joined us, and although the tension between him and Lillian was palpable, there was also a tacit understanding, a shared willingness to find a way forward. When it was time to say goodbye, Lillian approached me with cautious movements, as if she feared breaking the fragile peace we had built. "Thank you," she said simply, "for listening, for giving me this opportunity." "Thank you for taking the first step," I replied, and on an impulse that surprised both her and me, I offered her a hug. It was brief, awkward, but sincere, a small act of courage on both our parts. After Lillian left, I stood on the porch, watching her car drive away. Edward stood beside me in silence for a moment, and then he said, "I've never seen her like that. So vulnerable." "Crises have a way of doing that," I replied, thinking of my own transformations over the years. They force us to look inside ourselves and confront what we find, whether good or bad. "Do you think she's sincere?" he asked, doubt still present in his voice. "Time will tell," I answered, "but I think she's making a genuine effort, and that's already something valuable." That night, after Edward and David had gone to sleep, I went out to the backyard to gaze at the stars, something I used to do with Arthur on clear nights. I silently told him about my day, about Lillian, about the small and large changes that were happening in our family. I wish you were here to see it, my love, I whispered to the starry sky, to advise me, to hold my hand as we navigate these unknown waters. The wind gently rustled the leaves of the old orange tree, and for a moment I felt as if Arthur answered me, as if he told me I was doing the right thing, that forgiveness was not weakness, but the greatest of strengths. Robert found me there, contemplating the stars. He had come to check that everything was all right, as he did every night since the incident. "How are you, Eleanor?" he asked, sitting beside me on the wooden bench. "Confused," I admitted. "Hopeful, cautious, all at once." "It's natural," he said with that deep, reassuring voice of his. "You've been through a lot, and this situation with Lillian is complicated. Life is rarely simple, isn't it?" I smiled. "Rarely," I agreed. "But that's what makes it interesting. If everything were easy and predictable, where would the adventure be?" We laughed together under the starry sky, two old friends sharing a moment of peace amidst the storm that had been my life in recent weeks. And for the first time since that fateful day when Lillian ordered me to eat with the dogs, I felt that things could eventually be all right. I didn't know what the future held for our family, whether Lillian and Edward would completely reconcile, whether we would all live under the same roof again, whether the wounds would heal completely or leave permanent scars. But I had taken a step towards forgiveness, not out of weakness or convenience, but by conscious choice, out of a genuine desire to break the cycle of resentment and control that had marked our relationships. And that night, as the stars shone over Willow Creek, I felt that I had honored the name my parents gave me at birth. Eleanor, meaning light or shining one. Because even in the darkest moments, even when all seemed lost, I had kept the flame of hope alive, the belief that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. The following weeks passed with a strange normalcy, as if we were all learning again to be a family, but with different rules, with greater awareness of our limits and vulnerabilities. Edward adapted to his new job, coming home tired but satisfied each evening. David continued helping me with the foundation, showing a natural talent for connecting with the seniors who came to us. And I, at 68, discovered a new version of myself. Firmer, more confident, but also more open to the possibility of reconciliation. Lillian and Sophie were still in Miami, Florida, but video calls became more frequent and less tense. Little by little, Lillian began to show genuine interest in the foundation, asking about our projects, offering ideas from her experience in administration. Sophie, for her part, surprised me one day by asking if she could come spend a weekend with me. "Just with you, Grandma," she clarified on the phone. "I want you to teach me how to make those walnut cookies David likes so much, and I also want to talk about things." That "about things" hinted at much more than her words revealed. I knew it immediately. Sophie, at 14, was at that difficult stage where you're no longer a child, but not yet an adult, where everything seems confusing and emotions are intense and overwhelming. "Of course, my love," I replied. "You can come whenever you want. Your room is always ready for you." When that weekend arrived, I was surprised by the change in my granddaughter. The teenager who had left with a frown and defiant attitude had been replaced by a calmer, more present young woman. Her hair, previously streaked with purple, had returned to its natural brown. Her eyes, so much like Edward's when he was young, looked at me with a mixture of remorse and curiosity. "The house looks different," she commented as she put her small suitcase in the room I had prepared for her. "Or maybe it's me who sees things differently now." "Perhaps a little of both," I replied. "Houses, like people, change with time and experiences." That afternoon we baked cookies together, getting flour on ourselves, laughing when a batch came out too toasted, singing old songs I had taught her when she was little. It was in those simple moments, covered in sugar and oven warmth, that Sophie began to open up. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she said suddenly as she shaped the dough, "for how I behaved that day when Mom said those horrible things to you." I laughed. I shouldn't have. Her voice trembled slightly, and I could see that she struggled to look me in the eyes. "You were a child following your mother's example," I replied softly. We all make mistakes, Sophie. The important thing is to learn from them. Mom has changed, she continued, or she's trying to. Sometimes she cries when she thinks I'm not looking, and she talks a lot about you, about how strong you are, about how you created something good after becoming a widow instead of becoming bitter. Her words moved me deeply. I never would have imagined that Lillian would speak of me in those terms, that she would see me as an example of strength instead of a rival for Edward's affection. We are all more complex than we appear at first glance, I told her, as I wiped a little flour from her cheek, your mother included. People aren't just good or bad, Sophie. We are mixtures of light and shadow, of strength and weakness. Like that story you used to tell me when I was little, she recalled with a nostalgic smile, the one about the broken vase that was repaired with gold and became more beautiful than before. Kintsugi, I nodded, surprised she remembered that bedtime story I used to tell her, the Japanese art of repairing broken things with gold, transforming scars into beauty, exactly like that, my dear. That night, after dinner, we sat on the back porch under the stars, wrapped in blankets despite the mild weather. Sophie told me about her new school in Miami, about a literature teacher who had inspired her to write poetry, about her plans to study psychology someday to help people like Mom and like you, Grandma. Like me? I asked, intrigued. People who have been through difficult things but keep going, she explained, who use their pain to help others instead of becoming bitter. Her words, so mature for her age, made me think about how crises not only affect us, but also those around us, especially the younger ones who observe how we respond to adversity. Before she left, Sophie hugged me tightly, whispering, "I love you, Grandma," which was worth more than any formal apology, and asked me a question that took me by surprise. Do you think Mom and you can ever truly be friends? Not just tolerate each other for Dad and for us, but genuinely appreciate each other? I looked into her eyes, those hopeful eyes, and knew I had to be honest. I don't know, my love. Deep wounds take time to heal, but I believe we can build something new and valuable based on mutual respect. And who knows, maybe with time, that respect will transform into genuine affection. She seemed satisfied with my answer, or at least hopeful enough to continue believing in the possibility of a reconstructed family, different from before, but equally valid. The true turning point came a month later when Robert suffered a heart attack while working in his garden. It was David who found him, who called the ambulance, who stayed by his side until the paramedics arrived. When I received the call, I felt the ground open beneath my feet. Robert, my faithful friend, my constant support since Arthur's death, was fighting for his life at Portland Regional Medical Center. Edward immediately drove me to the hospital. He drove in silence, respecting my distress. In the waiting room, as the doctors worked to stabilize Robert, I felt vulnerable again, reminded of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change. What I never expected was to receive a call from Lillian barely an hour later. "I heard about Robert," she said, without preamble. "I'm taking the first flight to Portland." "You don't need to come," I replied, confused by her reaction. "Edward is with me, and David too." "I know." Her voice sounded resolute. "But I want to be there. Robert was kind to me, even when I didn't deserve it. And you shouldn't go through this alone." I didn't know what to say. The Lillian I knew would never have taken an emergency flight to support her mother-in-law and an elderly neighbor. However, 8 hours later, she appeared in the hospital waiting room with Sophie, both looking tired but determined. "How is he?" she asked, hugging Edward first, then David, and finally, with some shyness, me. "Stable but critical," I replied, still surprised by her presence. "The doctors say the next 48 hours will be decisive." Lillian nodded and, without another word, took off her coat, folded it carefully, and sat beside me. Sophie did the same on my other side, taking my hand in silence. And so we remained, an improbable family, united by common concern, by shared affection for a man who had been a silent witness to our conflicts and reconciliations. During the 3 days Robert was in intensive care, Lillian didn't leave our side. She organized shifts so that someone was always at the hospital. She brought homemade food so we wouldn't have to eat the bland hospital cafeteria food. She even managed to get a nurse to let us see Robert outside visiting hours. One night, while everyone else dozed in the waiting room, Lillian sat next to me with 2 cups of tea. "I couldn't sleep," she explained, offering me one. "And I thought maybe you couldn't either." I accepted the tea with a gesture of gratitude. Exhaustion and worry had broken down the usual barriers between us, allowing for a conversation that under other circumstances would have been impossible. "I was always afraid of getting old," Lillian confessed after a silence. "Seeing Robert like this, so vulnerable despite having been a strong man all his life, makes me think about my own future." "Aging isn't for cowards," I replied with a small smile. "But it has its rewards, wisdom, perspective, the freedom to finally be yourself without worrying so much about what others think." "You don't seem to be afraid," she observed. "Oh, I am," I admitted. "Afraid of dependence, of loneliness, of becoming a burden to Edward or the children. That's why I created the foundation, not just to protect myself legally, but to build a support network, to feel that I can still contribute in some way." Lillian was silent, reflecting on my words. Then, in an almost inaudible voice, she said, "I underestimated you. I thought you were weak because you were kind, that you were naive because you were generous. I was wrong. And I judged you as purely selfish and manipulative," I acknowledged, without looking at her, without realizing that perhaps you were acting from your own fears and insecurities. I was wrong too. We exchanged a look of mutual understanding, the first moment of genuine connection in 20 years of knowing each other. We weren't friends. We probably never would be in the traditional sense. But a mutual respect had been born, a recognition of each other's humanity beyond the roles of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law we had been playing. Robert survived, weak but determined to recover. He was moved to a regular room where we could visit him more freely. It was there, in that hospital room, smelling of disinfectant and medicine, that something happened that would change the course of our family forever. We were all gathered, Edward, David, Sophie, Lillian, and I. Robert, pale, but with lively eyes, watched us from his bed with a tired smile. "Well," he commented, his voice weak but humor intact, "I had to have a heart attack to see the entire Hayes family reunited and at peace." We laughed because it was true. Despite the painful circumstances, there was something beautiful about all of us being there, worried about him, supporting each other. "You should stay like this," Robert continued. "United. Life's too short to waste on grudges." His words, simple yet profound, resonated with all of us. Lillian was the first to respond, surprising everyone. "You're right, Robert," she said firmly, "and that's why I want to propose something." She turned to Edward, then to me. "I've been thinking a lot these past few weeks about family, about what truly matters, and I think we should try again, all of us together, but differently." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Edward asked, cautious but interested. "That we move back to Willow Creek," she replied. "But not as before. I propose we convert the house into 2 independent units. Eleanor would keep the ground floor, which is already adapted for her, and we would take the second floor with its own entrance. Each of us would have our space, our privacy, but close enough to support each other, and we would pay fair rent to the foundation, as is appropriate." Her proposal left us all speechless. It was practical, respectful, and showed that she had understood the core of the conflict, the need for independence and mutual respect. "What do you think, Mom?" Edward asked me. "It's your house, your decision." I looked at my family, these complex and sometimes difficult people, but who were, after all, my blood, my legacy, my reason for going on after losing Arthur. I thought about what he would have wanted, what I truly wanted. "I think," I finally said, "that it could work, with clear rules, with firm commitments, with the foundation always as the legal owner. But yes, we could try." Sophie's smile lit up the room. David nodded in approval. Edward looked relieved, as if a weight he had been carrying finally lightened. And Lillian looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before when she addressed me. Genuine gratitude. "We'll seal this properly," Robert declared from his bed. "When I get out of here, we'll have dinner together in Eleanor's garden and toast to new beginnings." 3 weeks later, with Robert recovering at his home, we fulfilled that promise. The garden that Arthur and I had cultivated with so much love was filled with voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Edward was grilling meat on the barbecue. Lillian and Sophie were setting the table. David and I were putting the finishing touches on the salad. Robert watched everything from his place of honor, still weak, but visibly happy to see us reunited. As we sat down to eat under the starry Oregon sky, surrounded by the scent of spring flowers, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't a naive peace, born of the belief that all our problems had disappeared. It was a mature peace, aware that there would be difficult days, disagreements, moments of tension, but also with the certainty that we now had better tools to face them. Honest communication, respect for each other's boundaries, the willingness to forgive without forgetting the lessons learned. During dessert, Edward proposed a toast. "To Mom," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that true strength isn't in dominating others, but in staying true to oneself. To Lillian, who had the courage to look within herself and change. To our children, who are wiser than we were at their age. And to Robert, our guardian angel, who almost had to die to bring us to our senses." We laughed and toasted, and when the glasses clinked together in the center of the table, I knew that that terrible day when Lillian ordered me to eat with the dogs had, paradoxically, been the catalyst for something beautiful. A reconstructed family. Not perfect, not idyllic, but authentic and resilient. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I went out to the garden to gaze at the stars once more. I felt Arthur's presence beside me, as real as the flowers surrounding us, as comforting as ever. "We did it, my love," I whispered into the night wind. "Not as we expected, not without pain, but we did it. Our family is moving forward, transformed, but united. And I'm still here, stronger than I ever imagined I could be." And as the night dew began to form on the flowers Arthur and I had planted so many years ago, I understood that my name had never been more appropriate, because that was me, that had always been me, Eleanor, which means light or shining one. Not the blind hope that ignores reality, but the tenacious hope that persists despite it, that finds paths where there seem to be none, that transforms pain into purpose and wounds into wisdom. My son brought his wife to live with me here. On the first day, she told me, "I'm in charge of this house now. Take your plate and go eat outside with the dogs." I smiled, picked up the phone, and did it. And that act of dignity, that moment of quiet courage, changed our lives forever. My story began with a humiliation and ended with a reconciliation, a journey I never would have imagined when Lillian, my son's wife, ordered me to eat with the dogs that first day they came to live in my house. But life has unexpected ways of teaching us, of transforming us, of reminding us who we truly are. I am Eleanor Hayes. I am 68 years old, and today I have shared how a moment of dignity changed the course of my family forever. When I picked up that phone and activated Protocol Dawn of the foundation I had created years ago, I wasn't just protecting my house and my well-being. I was reclaiming my worth as a person, my right to be respected in my own home. The New Dawn Foundation was born from my pain after losing my Arthur, my husband, but it became much more than legal protection. It transformed into a purpose, into a way to help other vulnerable seniors, into a testament that it's never too late to reinvent yourself. What began as a precautionary measure ended up being my greatest strength when the crisis arrived at my door. My son, Edward, had to face a difficult choice between his loyalty to me and to his wife. I saw his pain, his confusion, his shame when he didn't defend me that night. But I also saw his growth, his ability to acknowledge mistakes, to take responsibility. Sometimes children need to remember that their parents are not just figures of unconditional support, but people with their own dignity and rights. Lillian, whom I believed would be my enemy until the end, surprised me with her capacity for change. Behind her controlling and dismissive behavior was an insecure woman marked by her own family history, fighting her demons in the only way she knew how. Her transformation was not instantaneous or perfect, but it was genuine. Her gesture of selling her father's jewelry to donate to the foundation and her support during Robert's illness demonstrated that people can change when they find the courage to look honestly at themselves. My grandchildren, David and Sophie, learned lessons that books don't teach. They saw the consequences of disrespect and lack of communication, but they also witnessed the power of forgiveness and the possibility of rebuilding what seemed irrevocably broken. David, with his natural sensitivity, found a purpose in the foundation that resonated with his values. Sophie, initially influenced by her mother's attitudes, discovered a new way of relating, more authentic and compassionate. Robert, my faithful friend, almost had to lose his life to remind us all of what was truly important. His heart attack, though painful, was the final catalyst that united us as a family. Sometimes we need to face the fragility of life to value the connections we have, to let go of grudges that only consume our energy and inner peace. The house in Willow Creek, those walls that Arthur and I built with so much effort, went from being a battlefield to being a home again. Now for a reconstructed family, transformed by conflict but strengthened by reconciliation. The decision to divide it into two independent units perfectly symbolized our new relationship. Close, but with our own spaces. United, but respecting each other's boundaries. This story I have shared with you is not just about a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law in conflict. It is about the power of staying true to oneself, even in the most difficult moments. It is about how an act of dignity can trigger unexpected transformations. It is about the possibility of healing deep wounds, not by erasing them, but by integrating them into a new way of being and relating. When Lillian ordered me to eat with the dogs, I could have responded with anger, with tears, with pleas, but I chose quiet dignity, silent strength. I smiled, picked up the phone, and activated a plan I had prepared not out of distrust, but out of precaution. And that decision, that moment of clarity in the midst of chaos, changed the course of our lives. I'm not telling you it was easy. There were days of pain, of doubt, of steps backward. Reconciliation was not a single event, but a continuous process with advances and setbacks. But every step, every honest conversation, every boundary set and respected, brought us closer to a more authentic, healthier relationship. Today, as I tell you this story from my garden in Willow Creek, I can see Edward and Lillian preparing a barbecue in the backyard. David is helping Robert with his rehabilitation exercises, and Sophie is studying under the orange tree that Arthur planted when we bought the house. We are not a perfect family, but we are a family that has learned to communicate, to respect each other, to value the wisdom that only crises can teach us. And to you who have listened to my story to the end, I want to thank you for your time, for your attention, for allowing me to share this very personal experience. I hope that in my words you have found something that resonates with your own life, with your own struggles and hopes. If this story has moved you, made you reflect, or simply kept you company during these minutes, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, Grandma Remembered. Each week we share stories like mine, testimonies of people who have faced difficult situations and found the strength to overcome them, to transform them into opportunities for growth. Don't forget to activate the bell to receive notifications every time we publish a new video. And if you can, leave a comment telling me what you thought of this story, if you found yourself in a similar situation, or what you would have done in my place. Your comments not only help me feel accompanied, but they can also be a light for others who are going through difficult times. Liking this video is very important so that it can reach more people who may need to hear these words of hope and dignity. Sharing our stories is a way to build bridges, to remind us that we are not alone in our struggles. I also want to ask you for something special. If this channel has brought you value, if these stories have accompanied you in difficult moments or made you reflect, consider supporting us with a monetary thank you. This feature allows you to make a small donation that helps us cover production costs and enables us to continue bringing quality content daily. Your support, however small, makes a big difference in our work and allows us to reach more people with these stories of life and overcoming. Remember to visit our other videos where you'll find more testimonials like mine, stories of losses transformed into purposes, of crises turned into opportunities, of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength in the most difficult moments. I am Eleanor Hayes, and this has been my story. A story that began with a humiliation but ended with a reconciliation, with a transformed family, with the discovery of a strength I didn't know I had. Because sometimes, only when we face our greatest fears do we truly discover who we are. Thank you for joining me on this journey. See you in the next video on Grandma Remembered, where we will continue sharing stories that remind us it's never too late to start anew, to set healthy boundaries, to honor our dignity. Because as the name of this channel says, and as has been my experience, when Grandma remembered her worth, everything changed. If you enjoyed my story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can write more stories like this. Thanks a lot in advance. What about you? What would you do in this person's shoes? I'd really love to hear your thoughts, so drop them in the comments. I'm always curious to know what you think. Oh, and let me know where you've heard this story. If you want to hear more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many more waiting for you. Big hugs and see you next time. And see you.